On a quiet evening in the city, a police officer sat in his patrol car, scanning the streets as part of his usual patrol routine. His job, which had become almost robotic over the years, was a mix of keeping the streets safe and maintaining the authority that came with his badge. That evening, there was nothing unusual in the air, and the officer expected the usual uneventful shift. As he cruised down a fairly empty street, his eyes caught sight of a car making a sharp turn. It wasn't particularly suspicious, but something about the way the vehicle was driven caught his attention. The officer decided to pull over the car, thinking it might be a minor traffic violation. He radioed his intentions to his colleagues, and with a confident stride, he approached the vehicle. What the officer didn't know, however, was that the driver of the car was no ordinary citizen. The man behind the wheel, calm and collected, was the newly appointed chief of police for the city. At this moment, he was on his way home after an evening meeting. The chief of police, though known for his professionalism and strong leadership, had not yet become a widely recognized figure among his fellow officers. As the officer approached the car, he assumed that this would be like any other stop, a simple conversation with the driver about a potential traffic violation. He walked to the window, ready to begin his usual line of questioning. "Good evening, sir. I pulled you over because of the way you turned at the intersection back there," he said, his tone casual, not yet realizing who he was speaking to. The driver, the chief, remained calm and composed. He didn't react with anger or frustration, which could have been easy to do given the circumstances. Instead, he simply looked up at the officer, his expression polite but confident. "I understand, officer," the chief said in a measured tone. "I'm actually the chief of police for this city." The officer, caught off guard, stopped in his tracks for a moment. His eyes widened slightly as he processed the words the man had just said. A sudden realization hit him, but he still wasn't sure what to make of the situation. The chief of police, here, in front of him, at this very moment. The officer blinked a few times, almost in disbelief. He hadn't expected to stop someone of such importance, especially not during a routine stop. For a brief second, he hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. He could feel a slight shift in the atmosphere, a quiet tension building between them, though neither party had moved yet. The chief, seeing the officer's confusion, calmly reached for his wallet and pulled out his badge. He handed it over to the officer, allowing him to see the proof of his position. The officer took the badge and looked at it for a few seconds, still processing the situation. It wasn't just the chief's title that was surprising. It was the fact that the man before him was black, and that this encounter was happening in a city where such an exchange might not have been typical. The officer, still in a state of shock, took a step back. His mind raced as he wondered how to handle the situation. The chief of police in front of him was the very person who had the power to supervise him and others in the department. He realized that what had started as a simple traffic stop had just become something much bigger, and the tension between them began to grow, though neither said a word about it. "You said." The officer stood there for a moment, holding the badge in his hand, still trying to absorb the information. His mind was racing, but his body remained still. It was clear that he was now facing a person of great authority, someone who was in charge of the entire police department. But there was something about the situation that left him feeling unsure of how to react. The chief of police, aware of the officer's confusion, kept his expression calm. He didn't show anger or frustration, just a steady, professional demeanor. He understood that mistakes could happen, but he also knew that how this moment was handled would be important. The officer's reaction was crucial, and he needed to navigate it carefully. "Officer, I'm the chief of police for this city," the chief repeated, his voice calm yet firm. "I'm sure there was no harm intended, but I think it's important for you to know who I am." There was no hint of offense in his words. He wasn't looking for an apology. He simply wanted to acknowledge the reality of the situation. The officer finally looked up from the badge and met the chief's eyes. He felt embarrassed, but he couldn't show it. Instead, he cleared his throat and nodded awkwardly. He knew this was a mistake, a moment that he'd have to explain later, but for now, he just had to handle it. "Right. I see," the officer muttered. His mind was still trying to catch up with what had just happened. He pulled over the chief of police, someone who was supposed to be leading and overseeing officers like him. How could he have not recognized him? The thought made him feel even more awkward. Was there something wrong with him for not knowing what the chief looked like? The chief sensed the officer's discomfort. He could see the unease creeping into the man's expression, but he wasn't angry. In fact, he wasn't surprised. He knew that, despite his position, not everyone had memorized his face, or even realized who he was yet. The city was large, and he hadn't been in the role long enough for everyone to be familiar with him. "That's all right," the chief said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'm not expecting everyone to recognize me right away. But I do think it's important for us to maintain a certain level of professionalism in situations like this." His words were not an accusation, but a gentle reminder of the duty both men shared to represent the police force with respect. The officer nodded again, though it was clear he was still uncomfortable. He had never been in this kind of situation before, pulling over a fellow officer, let alone the chief. He felt like he was walking on eggshells, afraid that one wrong word might make things worse. "I'll make sure to be more aware in the future," the officer said, trying to regain some composure. His voice was sincere, but he couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment. He had made a simple mistake, but now it felt much bigger than it had before. It wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about his own professional judgment. And in this moment, he had failed. The chief, noticing the officer's unease, nodded in understanding. "I appreciate that," he said. "And remember, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we handle them, and what we learn from them." He wasn't looking for the officer to grovel. Instead, he wanted him to reflect on the situation and grow from it. The officer was silent for a moment, still processing the chief's words. It was clear that he wasn't just dealing with the consequences of a simple traffic stop gone wrong. He was dealing with something deeper, a realization about the responsibility that came with his badge and the choices he had to make in every situation. The officer stood there for a few moments, trying to collect his thoughts. He had never been in a situation like this before. It wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. It wasn't even just about the embarrassment of not recognizing the chief of police. There was something bigger at play, a deeper understanding of the responsibility he had as an officer and the impact that his actions could have, even in moments that seemed routine. The chief of police, seeing the officer's internal struggle, decided it was time to shift the tone of the encounter. Instead of lingering on the awkwardness, he took a step back and offered the officer an opportunity to regain his footing. "I appreciate your professionalism," the chief said, his voice steady. "It's not easy to handle these types of situations, but the way we respond to challenges is what defines us as officers." The officer nodded, still processing the weight of the chief's words. It was clear that the chief wasn't looking to escalate the situation. He wasn't interested in making the officer feel small or ashamed. Instead, he wanted to use this moment as a teaching opportunity, something that would benefit both of them in the long run. "I've seen you around the department," the officer said after a brief pause, his voice a little more confident now. "I just didn't realize you were the chief. I guess we haven't really had a chance to meet yet." The chief smiled, understanding that this was a normal part of the process. He had been in his position for only a short time, and not everyone would immediately recognize him. But he also understood that this moment could serve as a reminder to the officer about the importance of awareness and respect in their line of work. "Well, now you know," the chief replied, his smile warm but firm. "And I think it's important for both of us to remember that, no matter our rank or title, we all share a common goal. We're here to serve and protect. And that means looking out for each other, too." The officer felt a shift in the conversation. It wasn't about the awkwardness anymore. It was about something deeper, about the shared responsibility of being a part of the police force, regardless of one's rank. This moment had become a lesson not just for him, but for the chief as well. The officer, now feeling more comfortable, began to relax a little. "I understand," he said. "I guess I was just thrown off, not expecting to pull over someone so important." The chief nodded, acknowledging the officer's feelings. "It happens, but the key is how we move forward from moments like this. We have to learn from them and use them to grow. Every interaction we have, no matter how small, matters." The officer thought about this for a moment. He realized that it wasn't just about the chief's rank or the power that came with it. It was about the influence he had to make real change, to set an example for the rest of the department. And here, in this small, unplanned moment, the chief had done just that. "I won't forget this," the officer said, his voice sincere. "I'll make sure to approach things differently in the future." The chief gave a small nod, a look of approval in his eyes. "That's all anyone can ask for. We're all constantly learning, growing, and improving. And sometimes it's these small moments that teach us the most." As the officer returned the chief's badge, both men felt the weight of the encounter shift. The tension had dissipated, and what was once an awkward stop had transformed into a conversation that held a deeper meaning. The officer's respect for the chief had grown, and in that moment, he understood just how important it was to not only recognize one's mistakes, but to learn from them in a meaningful way. As the chief of police handed back his badge and the officer returned to his patrol car, the brief encounter lingered in both of their minds. It wasn't just another routine traffic stop. This had become something more, a reflection on the way people, especially those in positions of power, could shape the actions and mindset of others, even in the most unexpected moments. The officer watched as the chief of police drove away, his car disappearing down the street. For a brief moment, he just sat in his patrol car, reflecting on the conversation. He had always thought of himself as a professional, as someone who did his job well. But this moment had forced him to question himself, to consider what it truly meant to be part of a larger team, a family of officers who shared the same mission. The chief's calm and measured response to the situation had stuck with him. Most people, if they had been in the chief's shoes, might have reacted angrily, or at the very least, had some sharp words to say. But the chief had chosen a different path. He had turned what could have been a tense, uncomfortable exchange into a teaching moment, a lesson not just for the officer, but perhaps for anyone who heard about the incident. It was a reminder that no matter the rank or the role, respect and professionalism should always guide the way. As the officer resumed his patrol, he found himself thinking more deeply about the power of his own actions. He had been in situations before where he could have handled things better, where he could have been more patient, more understanding, or more willing to learn from the moment. But this incident had forced him to realize just how crucial it was to remain calm and respectful, even when things didn't go as planned. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how important it was for officers to look out for one another, to support each other and work as a team. The chief had been right. It wasn't just about enforcing the law or carrying out orders. It was about maintaining integrity, showing empathy, and being a part of something bigger than oneself. The officer knew that this was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his career. Meanwhile, the chief of police had driven back to the department, his thoughts also heavy with the encounter. He had been in law enforcement for many years, and he had seen the challenges that came with it, the pressures, the difficult situations, and the inherent tensions that sometimes existed between officers and the communities they served. But this moment had reminded him that leadership was not just about authority. It was about understanding, guiding, and helping others grow. The chief had chosen not to escalate the situation, not because he was weak or afraid, but because he knew that it was more important to be a teacher than a disciplinarian in that moment. He recognized that the officer, while making a mistake, had not acted out of malice. It was a simple lapse in judgment, something that anyone could have done. And instead of turning the situation into a confrontation, the chief had used it as an opportunity to impart a lesson in professionalism and self-awareness. As he parked his car and walked into the station, the chief reflected on how these moments, though small, could have such a lasting impact. They could shape the way officers viewed their roles, their interactions with the community, and most importantly, the way they viewed each other. It wasn't just about stopping criminals or making arrests. It was about building trust, respect, and understanding within the force. For both the officer and the chief, the experience was a reminder that law enforcement was more than just a job. It was a responsibility to be the best versions of themselves, to always strive for growth and improvement. And in the end, it was the ability to learn from these moments that truly defined the quality of an officer and the strength of the force they represented. The news about the encounter between the officer and the chief of police quickly spread throughout the department. Within hours, officers were discussing the incident in hushed tones. Some were surprised, others were curious, and a few even whispered about how the officer had handled the situation. It was clear that the moment had left an impact, but not all reactions were the same. There was a mix of disbelief, confusion, and even a sense of admiration for the way the chief had handled the situation with such grace. The officer who had made the mistake found himself the subject of many conversations. At first, he felt a wave of embarrassment when he overheard colleagues talking about the incident. He couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was judging him for not recognizing the chief of police. But as time passed, he began to realize that most of the discussions were not about the mistake he had made, but rather about how the chief had turned the situation into a lesson. It wasn't about condemning the officer for not recognizing the chief, but about what happened next, the professionalism, the calm, and the ability to learn from the moment. In the days that followed, the officer began to notice something subtle but significant. There was a shift in the department's atmosphere. Conversations among officers seemed to take on a different tone, one that was more thoughtful, more reflective. Even those who hadn't directly witnessed the encounter began to talk about the importance of handling mistakes with grace and humility. The chief's example had set a new standard, one that was not based on power or authority, but on how each officer treated their colleagues and the community they served. The officer himself started to view his role differently. He realized that, as a member of the force, he had a responsibility not only to enforce the law, but also to set an example for others. The way he interacted with his fellow officers, the way he handled his own mistakes, and the way he carried himself all played a part in creating the kind of police department he wanted to be a part of. The chief, too, took time to reflect on the situation. Although the moment had seemed like just another encounter at the time, he began to realize that it had much more significance. It wasn't just about the officer's mistake or the way he had responded. It was about the lesson that could be learned from it, a lesson that applied not just to the officer, but to everyone in the department. So, the chief decided to take action. He called for a meeting with his officers, not to scold or reprimand anyone, but to open up a conversation about the importance of professionalism, humility, and self-awareness in their work. It wasn't a mandatory training session or a lecture. It was an honest discussion about the real challenges officers faced and how they could learn from one another. During the meeting, the chief shared his thoughts about the encounter and how it had reminded him of the importance of setting a positive example. "We all make mistakes," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "What matters is how we respond to those mistakes, how we handle them, and how we learn from them. We're all part of a team, and that means we need to have each other's backs, no matter what." The officer who had made the mistake sat in the back of the room, listening quietly. He felt a mix of gratitude and relief. It was clear that the chief wasn't using the situation as a way to single him out. Instead, he was using it as a teaching opportunity for everyone, a chance to remind them all of the values that truly mattered in law enforcement. By the end of the meeting, there was a renewed sense of camaraderie among the officers. They didn't just leave with a sense of duty. They left with a greater understanding of how their actions, both big and small, affected the department as a whole. They understood that their professionalism wasn't just about following rules. It was about making each other better, day by day. And it all started with one small encounter on a quiet street that, in the end, turned into something much more impactful than anyone had expected. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the department continued to shift. Officers, once focused solely on their individual roles, began to interact more openly with each other. There was a renewed sense of respect and understanding that had not been as prominent before. Even the most seasoned officers, those who had been part of the force for years, began to show more patience and consideration, not only toward their colleagues, but also toward the people they served. The officer who had made the mistake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. No longer did he feel like an outsider or someone who had made a huge error that would define his career. Instead, he felt more connected to his fellow officers, more a part of the team. As time went on, he began to notice how much easier it was to engage with others, to share ideas, and to learn from his mistakes without feeling like he was being judged. The department had changed, but so had he. He was becoming a better officer, more aware of the importance of empathy, respect, and teamwork in law enforcement. One day, as he was sitting at his desk, filling out reports, the chief walked into the office. It was a typical day, with officers bustling about, busy with their tasks, but there was a noticeable difference. The chief didn't just walk past his officers. He stopped and engaged with them, asking how they were doing, how they felt about the changes that had been taking place. He was no longer just a figurehead in the department. He had become a true leader, someone who genuinely cared about the well-being and growth of those under his command. The chief's leadership style had clearly left an impression. Officers no longer viewed him as someone they were simply accountable to, but as a mentor and guide. His approachability and willingness to listen created an environment where everyone felt heard, respected, and valued. It wasn't about hierarchy or titles. It was about being a part of something greater than themselves. And that shift in perspective made all the difference. During a department-wide meeting one morning, the chief took a moment to address the officers. He spoke about the importance of trust and transparency, not just within the department, but also with the community they served. "We are here to build relationships," he said, his voice strong yet compassionate. "We are not just enforcers of the law. We are a part of this community, and it's our job to ensure that everyone feels safe and respected." His words resonated deeply with everyone in the room. They had heard similar messages before, but this time, it felt different. The chief wasn't just giving a speech. He was speaking from the heart. He was walking the walk, showing them that true leadership wasn't about authority. It was about fostering trust, building connections, and encouraging others to be their best selves. It was about leading with integrity and honesty, even when things were tough. For the officer who had been at the center of the earlier encounter, the chief's words served as a reminder of how far he had come. He realized that the chief had shown him a different way of approaching his role as an officer, not as someone who simply followed orders, but as someone who was constantly learning, growing, and striving to be a better version of himself. It was a lesson that had begun with a simple, unexpected moment, a traffic stop that had turned into an opportunity for growth and change. As the days went on, the officer became more confident in his abilities. He began taking on more responsibilities, offering to help his colleagues with difficult cases, and finding ways to make a positive impact in the community. He no longer viewed himself as just a cog in the machine, but as an integral part of the force, someone who had a responsibility not only to enforce the law but to contribute to the well-being of the entire department. The transformation was gradual, but it was undeniable. The department had become a place where officers supported each other, where learning and growth were encouraged, and where respect wasn't just something spoken about, but actively practiced. The chief's leadership had set a new standard, one that everyone in the department had embraced. In the end, the officer knew that the true power of the encounter wasn't just in the lesson he had learned or the example set by the chief. It was in the way that moment had brought everyone together, creating a stronger, more unified force. It wasn't just a story about one officer and one mistake. It was a story about the power of leadership, understanding, and the ability to turn even the most awkward of situations into an opportunity for growth. The shift in the department's culture didn't go unnoticed by the community either. As the officers began to work more closely together, their interactions with the public improved as well. There was a new energy in the air, one that was filled with cooperation and respect. People started to notice the difference in the way officers approached them, not just as enforcers of the law, but as individuals who genuinely cared about their safety and well-being. For the officer who had made the mistake, this change was especially evident. He had always been focused on the technical aspects of his job, making sure he followed protocol and adhered to rules. But now he was starting to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just about carrying out the law. It was about understanding people, listening to their concerns, and engaging with them in a way that fostered trust. He began to see the value in building relationships, not only with his colleagues, but with the people he was sworn to protect. One evening, during a routine patrol, the officer found himself in a neighborhood he hadn't spent much time in before. It was a quiet area, with families walking their dogs and children playing in the streets. As he drove through, he noticed a few familiar faces, a couple of residents who waved at him, a local shopkeeper who smiled and nodded as he passed by. It was clear that the community had begun to trust the police more, and that trust had been earned through actions, not just words. A few weeks earlier, such an interaction might have been rare. But now, the officer realized that he was no longer just another uniformed figure driving through the neighborhood. He was a part of the community, someone who had taken the time to listen and connect, someone who had shown that they were there not only to protect but to understand. The small gestures, waving at residents, stopping to talk briefly with locals, or simply smiling, had made a huge difference in how the officer was perceived. He wasn't just a distant authority figure. He was a person they could trust and relate to. Back at the station, the chief continued to encourage these kinds of connections. He often spoke about the importance of community engagement and how the department could do more to foster positive relationships. The chief made it clear that officers should spend time in neighborhoods, getting to know the people they served and showing that they were more than just there to enforce rules. He stressed that every interaction, no matter how small, had the potential to build or break trust. The officer found himself increasingly drawn to this idea. He realized that his role wasn't just about responding to calls or making arrests. It was about being present in the community, showing up for people when they needed help, and letting them know that the police were there to support them, not to judge them. One day, as the officer was finishing his shift, he received a call from a local resident. The woman on the other end of the line had a concern about a neighborhood issue, but it wasn't a major crime. Just a small matter of some kids riding bikes too fast through the streets. Instead of ignoring the call or passing it off as unimportant, the officer took the time to listen. He reassured the woman that he would take care of the situation and made sure to follow up with her the next day, just to check in. It wasn't the kind of problem that required an arrest or an investigation, but it was something that showed the officer's growing commitment to being present and engaged. The woman was appreciative of his attention, and it made the officer realize that, sometimes, the little things mattered the most. By simply taking the time to listen and respond, he had made a positive impact in someone's life. The department's culture continued to shift in subtle yet powerful ways. The officers, once focused only on their own roles and responsibilities, now understood the importance of teamwork, communication, and connection. And as the officer's confidence in his role grew, he felt a renewed sense of pride in his work. It wasn't just about carrying out his duties. It was about being part of a larger mission, one that involved not only law enforcement, but building stronger communities and fostering trust wherever possible. Through the leadership of the chief, the department had learned a valuable lesson: that respect, patience, and humility weren't just ideals. They were the foundation for building something much more powerful, a force that truly cared for the people it served. The officer now understood that the role of a police officer wasn't just about what they did in uniform. It was about the lasting impact they made in the lives of the people they encountered every day. As time went on, The officer who had once felt embarrassed about the traffic stop became one of the department's most respected figures. Not because of any particular achievement or flashy moment, but because of the way he had embraced the lessons he had learned. His commitment to improving himself, to building trust with his colleagues and the community, had not gone unnoticed. It wasn't the type of recognition that came with awards or medals. It was the kind of respect earned through consistent actions, day after day. The officer had grown into a role model in his own right. He made it a point to mentor newer recruits, sharing the lessons he had learned from his own experience. He taught them the importance of humility, the value of learning from mistakes, and the need for a calm and professional demeanor in even the most uncomfortable situations. The shift in his mindset had led him to become someone his fellow officers looked up to, someone they could count on not just for guidance in their work, but for support in their personal growth as well. One afternoon, as he was walking through the department's hallway, the officer ran into a fellow officer who had been struggling with a difficult situation in his personal life. The officer had been feeling down and unsure of himself, uncertain about his place in the department. He confided in the officer, telling him how overwhelmed he felt by the pressures of his job and his personal challenges. Instead of offering quick advice or brushing it off, the officer simply listened. He let his colleague talk, offering words of encouragement when needed. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that sometimes all a person needed was someone to listen. The officer's willingness to be there for his colleague wasn't just about offering solutions. It was about showing empathy, understanding that everyone faces struggles, and sometimes simply being present can make all the difference. Over time, the department as a whole became known for its approachability and its connection with the community. It wasn't that the officers were perfect. They still faced challenges, still made mistakes, but they had learned how to work through them together. The department's culture had shifted from one focused on authority to one focused on service. Officers weren't just viewed as enforcers of the law. They were seen as people who genuinely cared about making the community a better place. The chief, too, had grown through the experience. He had always been an effective leader, but the encounter with the officer had reminded him of the importance of fostering an environment of understanding and growth. He had seen firsthand how a single interaction could change the course of someone's career, and he had made it his mission to ensure that such interactions continued to be a part of the department's culture. He continued to encourage open dialogue, professional development, and community engagement, making sure that every officer knew they were valued, and that their growth was just as important as the work they did on the streets. Looking back on the incident that had set everything in motion, the officer could hardly believe how far he had come. What had started as an awkward and embarrassing moment had turned into a defining chapter in his career. It had sparked a change not only within him but within the entire department, and it had reminded him that every day was an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to become a better version of himself. He had learned that leadership wasn't about being in charge. It was about guiding others, offering support, and leading by example. It was about showing respect to every individual, no matter their rank or position. The officer understood now that the true value of being in law enforcement wasn't in enforcing the law, but in the connections built and the trust earned from those they served. As he continued his work, the officer was no longer just a police officer. He had become a part of something much bigger, a movement within the department that emphasized growth, understanding, and collaboration. He had learned that it wasn't about how many arrests he made or how many laws he enforced. It was about the relationships he built and the positive impact he had on the community. And so, as the officer drove through the streets, patrolling the very same neighborhood where he had once felt disconnected, he smiled. The shift in his perspective, in the department's approach, had made all the difference. He wasn't just doing his job. He was living out the lessons he had learned every single day. And that, he realized, was the most rewarding part of all.